What's even scarier than hearing somebody break into your home? Perhaps not hearing anything at all until it's too late. Waking up in the night, squinting into the dark, and making out a figure, somebody else in the room with you.
Hello?
Nobody pulls off this kind of scare quite like Mike Flanagan. In 2016, this writer-director was on the up. After a run of successful genre films such as Oculus, Ouija, Origin of Evil, and Before I Wake, he began working on a secret project with his partner, Kate Seagull. This project was kept confidential until its premiere at South by Southwest in 2016, and was then released exclusively for Netflix a month later. This film was Hush, a home invasion horror that used classic tropes from the genre dating all the way back to The Spiral Staircase and Wait Until Dark, whilst also feeling akin to modern slasher movies. Hush marked the beginning of a 7-year-long relationship between Flanigan and Netflix, and his next film, Gerald's Game, was released direct to Netflix 1 year later. Based on a Stephen King novel, this was another single-location horror movie about a woman alone in a house with a dangerous intruder lurking in the shadows. With this 1-2 hit of slick, tight domestic horror movies, Flanagan solidified his reputation as one of the most celebrated and innovative new voices in the horror genre. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Mike Flanagan's Hush and Gerald's Game. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 30. In this episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at 2 terrifying Mike Flanagan films. That's Hush from 2016 and Gerald's Game from 2017. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. Please go and give both movies a watch before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these 2 brilliantly nasty little movies, I've got a long-time friend of the pod. She's been here since the very beginning. She made her first appearance in part 1 of our slasher series, and she's been on many, many times since. She is also the creator and producer of the brilliant new horror fiction podcast Eerie, creator and host of the Final Girls podcast, and of course, one half of the Successionistas.
The Successionistas!
Anna Bogutskaya, hello!
Hello!
How are you doing, Anna? Thank you for being here we are recording on what is like the hottest day in human history, it feels like.
I'm not okay, Mike.
No.
I know you're not okay too.
It's not good.
I hope your listeners are okay. Because I saw a very funny TikTok today. Let's just go straight into it. A woman who was fanning herself. I wonder if she's from the UK. Couldn't quite place her voice. And she was like, I'm in trouble. I need to, gain control of my life because this heat wave is just showing me I cannot do hell. So I need to be a better person.
Yes.
And I think I'm there.
Yes, I love this. If there's one thing that makes us all want to be better people and avoid the fires of hell, it's this weather. Well, actually, because obviously we're recording this in summer right now, Anna, because you are a very busy person, but it's likely that actually by the time this episode goes out, it's going to be around Halloween. It's going to be around the spooky season. So hopefully we're all going to be huddled inside where it's cold out. We've got the heating on, we've got blankets over us, and we're enjoying a bit of cold air. That's what I'm hoping. And speaking of locking ourselves away inside the home, let me ask you about home invasion, this subgenre that we've been discussing for the last 30 weeks at this point. Anna, what are your thoughts on home invasion?
First of all, great segue.
Yes.
Secondly, you know this because we've spoken about this. I love this subgenre. I'm definitely going to do a season of my own of this, but I'm going to put it away for a long time because it is genuinely the scariest subgenre for me.
Oh, yeah.
Like, fundamentally, on a really gut level for me, I have a very hard time watching home invasion movies. And that is primarily because it is deeply troubling to me, kind of as a concept. Just the idea of someone getting into your house while you're there or while you're not there is terrifying to me.
Oh, my God. It is. And
really scary.
And that is the response that I've had from so many people, even people like you, even the most like seasoned horror experts and horror fans react that way still to home invasion. Why do you think that is? Why is it for so many people like the most troubling kind of triggering subgenre?
Well, because the home is our safe space, right? It's the place where we can relax. It's a family home, or wherever you're building your family, or if you just live by yourself like I do. I think that's particularly triggering, especially if you're a woman. So that's kind of a very basic explanation for it, but I think it rings really universal to most people. And there's also a different thing, right? Because whatever your home is, like it's a big thing to invite someone into your home, into your house. It's where you lay your head to rest. It's where you have all your things. It's essentially a representation of you as a person. So for that to be invaded, for that to be kind of violated in some way by an unwelcome presence, be that supernatural or real, is horrifying, because then everything becomes sort of tainted. Like, if I imagine someone being in my home without my permission, it makes me look at everything weird. Suddenly, the desk doesn't feel right. The bed feels uncomfortable or, unsafe. Everything feels dirty, even when it's not. There's like, I've never had a home invasion happen in my house. I did when I was a kid. My parents' like first or second flat when I was a baby got burgled, but I was way too young to remember that. But there is kind of a constant fear. I don't think I could live in a house if it had been kind of broken into. I would just not be able to stay there.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think is scarier? Like a kind of, like living in a city, like you do now, where you're constantly surrounded by people, right? Or being like in the middle of nowhere, like in the country, for example?
Well, I'm curious because you used to live in a big city, and now you live kind of not in the country, but sort of in a smaller place. Yeah. And I genuinely don't know, because I reckon both. Because on the one hand, when you're in the middle of nowhere, it's that thing of, if something happens, you're kind of stranded by yourself, and maybe you need a car to get to the nearest house or the nearest block of people or hospital or something like that. But in a city, I live in a really busy street where there's always people around, always, at any point of the day or night. And that to me screams safety. But I know that's also very scary for a different kind of person. So I think it's an entirely personal relationship with what we find or what we define as a safe space or as a safe environment, and what makes us feel more comfortable. Like there's another thing there as well. Living in the country or in isolated places, usually it's houses, right?
Yes.
As opposed to buildings or blocks of flats. I hate that idea. I hate the idea of being on the ground floor. I've never lived on a ground floor. I've lived in a house once, in a house share, and our room was at the top floor. I've always stayed like 3 floors up, partially because of this reason. I hate the idea of anyone looking into my window, and I hate the idea of kind of the house just being there, like the door just being right there on the ground. Yeah. It freaks me out.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, I think, because we do live in a like quieter, more rural area now, we're in a house. And even though that is maybe traditionally a more kind of scary kind of place, in a way, I think I thought about it more when I lived in London, because I had a ground floor flat in London. And, statistically, I'm sure it's more likely that we'd have had a break-in living in South London than we would now in Kent, like it's just like that happens more and more, doesn't it? But at the same time, yeah, it's nice to be surrounded by people, in a way that it doesn't feel like, okay, like as long as I'm sort of careful, hopefully everything will be okay, you know? But this is the thing, right? This is where this subgenre does really get us where we live, I think, because we've all thought about that. We've all thought about, like, what would I use as a weapon? How would I get out if somebody got in or whatever? You know, you can't help but think these things through. And I think in the best home invasion movies, you're thinking about that too, right? You're with the main character being like, how is this person going to get out of this? And also, so often they don't. Like movies like The Strangers or whatever, where it's just like, oh, well, fuck, they all just die and that's it, you know? Because that's the other thing, is that these movies are quite bleak, aren't they, a lot of the time?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. How would you get out of if someone invaded your home? What would you do?
Oh my God, I'd be useless, Anna. Like I've talked about this so much recently, but I'd be so useless. I'm the guy that would probably just like politely invite them in rather than actually do anything about it. No. Well, no, it depends on the situation, obviously. Like if there was somebody literally breaking and entering, I don't know what I would do, because we've got a like a 3-story townhouse that we live in, and our bedroom is on the top floor of that. So if somebody got in and through our front door 2 floors down, I don't know what the hell we'd do. We'd just have to like leap out the window and hope that we survived it, basically.
It's time to start practicing those leaps. Just in case. Yeah, just keep a knife in every single room. A knife and a baseball bat.
This is the thing. At least if we were in America, right, we'd have a gun in our bedside cabinet or whatever.
Oh, so this is the thing that I was wondering, and I'm wondering, since you're watching all these films, and a lot of them are American and some of them aren't, is it the house thing, right? Is it an American thing or is it a UK thing? Do you have more than like one entry point into the house? Do you have like multiple doors like they have in America? Because this also fucks me up. Why do you need so many doors into one house?
Yeah, that is a good point. Well, in my house now, it's like terraced house. So no, there's only a front door and a back door.
Great.
And our back garden is like entirely surrounded by fences. Like there's not even a gate. So you can't actually get in and out through the back door. So no. But in the house I grew up in, it was like a detached house, and that had a front door, a back door, and also a side entrance.
Too many doors.
Too many doors. No one needs that many doors.
Yeah, hate doors. So this is why my ideal house, Mike, is a loft conversion where there are no doors. Literally, just like a big, ample space. That's a space you don't often see in home invasion movies. It's just like a loft where the only door is like the door to the bathroom. And that's it. The only walls that exist are the walls that surround the bathroom. Everything else is just open plan.
Love this. Yeah. Would you, if you were offered a house, or if you were able to get a house with a panic room like Jodie Foster and Kristen Stewart have, do you like the idea of a panic room, or does the idea of a panic room terrify you?
No, I kind of dig the idea of a panic room.
Yeah.
I really do. I think I might abuse it though, and then I'd break something. Like I'd go into the...
It'd be good for writing, right? You just
It would be great,
away.
yeah.
No signal.
It would be great also be like, oh, I just really don't want to speak to this person, so I'm going to go in my panic room for 2 days. And just have a nap. I would transform it into my nap room or my like Menti B room, and then something would break and I'd get locked in, and then I'd just die of starvation because I ate all the chickpeas and the snacks before I actually had a panic situation.
I like the idea of it being a Menti B room, like you just shut yourself away, like Jodie Foster does, where she just lets out that scream. Like you can just go in there and scream for a bit, basically. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Have a little like punching bag there, so you could get your workouts in. Yeah. Have a lot of like protein heavy snacks. Yeah, it sounds fabulous. I'd love that.
Love this. Love it. Well, there you go. Well, we're gonna get into 2 brilliant classic kind of domestic set movies from the last 10 years, but I want to start off by asking you about Mike Flanagan. Obviously, both these movies are Mike Flanagan. Such an interesting, maybe one of our most kind of popular and prolific horror filmmakers of the last decade, right? What do you think of Mike Flanagan and the Flaniverse?
I'm a big fan of Flanagan and the Flaniverse. I've been acutely aware and excited about his rise to the status of kind of the king of contemporary horror over the last decade, as you alluded to. You know, I remember watching Hush at the time. I remember Oculus ridiculous as well. I remember the name floating around. I remember noticing him kind of on the indie horror scene. And Gerald's Game, which we'll talk about later, was kind of the first big sort of move into something larger for him. And then obviously all the stuff that he's done with TV, The Haunting of Bly Manor, The Haunting of Hill House, Midnight Mass, The Midnight Club.
Oh,
like, he genuinely has, I think Flanagan, alongside my problematic fave, Ryan Murphy, and American Horror Story, have been the two key names to give rise to not that well discussed golden age of horror television. So all the stuff that we're seeing, kind of horror series right now, there's, you know, we're saturated with them on every single streaming platform. It's been the return of M. Night Shyamalan with The Servant. There's been amazing stuff like Channel Zero, like a lot of great and not that great stuff. But it's Flanagan and Murphy who really expanded the idea of horror on television. And I think Flanagan much more successfully than Murphy. I love American Horror Story, but it is patchy as fuck. And
it is.
Hill House, which I rewatched recently, is just such a massive accomplishment, as is Midnight Mass, I would say. So, and then, you know, all the other films that he's done, like being able to jump between series and film, is just, he's so distinctive as a filmmaker. And so as well, without necessarily being like a contrarian kind of creator, is so distinctive that some people just don't like his vibe of horror.
Right.
And that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool.
I find that interesting. Yeah, I do find that really interesting. How do you think, what is it about his work then that makes him distinctive? Like, if you were to describe somebody who'd never seen a Flanagan film, what is a typical kind of Flanagan film? How would you describe his style, do you think?
The Mike Flanagan horror creeps you out while making you cry.
Yes.
And I say creeps because he's not into jump scares. He's not into grotesqueries. He's not into body horror. Although, you know, Gerald's Game, back to differ. We'll come to that. But he is so a horror of the heart.
Yeah.
You know, he is interested in atmosphere and creep and dread, and very much the emotional heart of his character. So it's very character-driven horror. It's very emotional. I know some people have accused him of being sentimental.
Yes.
But, you know, people have also accused Spielberg of being sentimental. Sentimental is not a bad word. It does not make something badly made or badly written or terrible in any sense. It is a tone. And if you're not interested in that, or it doesn't work for you, fine. But, you know, I like a little cry with my spookies.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I completely agree with you. It's that heart. And, you know, you're right. Spielberg is somebody who people label sentimental. And of course, Stephen King too, right? Like one of our most celebrated horror authors of all time. He is known for creating absolute nightmarish stories, but also often can go quite schmaltzy, you know, especially with his endings.
So often.
And I think, you know, there is that vibe to Flanagan too. There is this weird parallel, I feel like, right? I mean, it's no coincidence, right, that Flanagan does adapt a lot of Stephen King's works, but they seem to have such a similar style and sensibility, don't they, I think, in the way they tell stories. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there was a roster of like truly excellent Stephen King adaptations in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like Misery and Dolores Claiborne and Stand By Me and Shawshank Redemption, like stuff that isn't necessarily always horror. Like Dolores and Shawshank are dramas with some horror elements to it. But I think there was never a filmmaker until Flanagan who so singularly captures the heart and the frequency of horror in which Stephen King operates. And that's quite an interesting thing. And I've been rereading his first book of essays, Dance Macabre, which is like a collection of his essays on horror, horror movies, horror fiction, writing, what makes us scared. It's very kind of American for obvious reasons. Yeah. But he does kind of write about these kind of levels of horror, right? He writes about the gross out level. He writes about terror, and he writes about dread, and he has dabbled in all those things, sometimes in the same book or in the same story. And I think Flanagan does the same thing. He operates or weaves in all those three levels of horror making. And that's why I think they balance each other so well. King on the page and Flanagan on the screen.
Yeah. Everything he makes feels like a Stephen King adaptation, even the ones that aren't. Like Midnight Mass feels like you're watching Salem's Lot or something, right? And of course, even The Haunting of Hill House, I know a lot of people, and I get this, a lot of people that were fans of Shirley Jackson's book didn't like the changes that he made to it. And I think in a way, apart from the title and the fact that it's Hill House, it feels more like a Stephen King story than a Shirley Jackson story as well, you know? There's something really, like that idea of kind of returning to your childhood and the monsters. There's almost something like, that reminds me of something like It or something like that, you know? Like, and I think that is just naturally just kind of woven in to a lot of Mike Flanagan's work, you know?
It's a really interesting point. I think you do have a strong point there, especially with It, the kind of the return to their childhood
thing. We've got the childhood storyline and childhood cast, and then the adult cast in the present day. And
totally.
That, you know, that kind of
thing. I will say, I when I first watched Hill House, I had not read Shirley Jackson's novel, and I've been going on a Shirley Jackson expedition this past year, reading all her stuff. And I read Hill House at the end of last year, and I rewatched Hill House, the show, just last week, and kind of kept going back and forth between the book and the show. And genuinely, I think it's a glorious adaptation, because there's you know, specific moments where he references or readjusts Jackson's writing in like directly verbatim in the show.
Yeah,
but it does so with that Stephen King sensibility, right?
Yeah,
it expands it to a series instead of making it lifting everything that's from the page. It kind of goes deeper into what's between the lines and what the essence of those characters are, and creates something new out of it, but then keeps it grounded in Jackson's sentences and her words, which are just so haunting and gothic and beautiful. And I think there's this additional dimension to Flanagan. You know, we talked a bit about him as a director, but he's a writer. You know, he's incredibly verbose. That's the other thing about his work, and people have held it against him, you know, king of the monologues and all this stuff. He loves a 10-page monologue, bless his heart.
He does.
I personally love this. I know that people don't, but I'm like, fuck yes, give me Hamish Linklater like talking to the camera for 7 straight minutes. I'm gonna lap that shit up. Absolutely. Existential vampires, existential ghosts, existential like anything. Yes, into it.
Well, and I think what I love so much about him is that he gives us all of that stuff we've talked about. He gives us that heart, those great performances, those monologues, that emotion. But he's fucking good at horror too. Like, this is the thing that I think people almost kind of underestimate him for, is just how good he is at scares, at gore when he wants to do. Like, you know, there are some images in The Haunting of Hill House that just like have never left me, you know. And he is, you mentioned,
like which one?
Well, like the guy, the floating man that comes to retrieve his hat, and like just some of those sorts of things. And he does that kind of, you mentioned this earlier, like he's so good at the kind of dread and the creepy kind of scares, you know. And you don't always get a jump scare with Flanagan's work, right? But you get that brilliant thing that people love to kind of write posts about, oh, did you spot the figure in the background of this shot and this shot? And, you know, oh my God, if you stare for long enough, something is lingering in the dark behind our main character or whatever. And that is, I love that shit. You know, it really creeps me out. So,
and he also stays on the scary bit for longer than you expect him to. Like that sort of floating hat man in Hill House is a perfect example, because, and the Moonlight Man in Gerald's Game as well, where he just keeps a camera on this thing when another filmmaker, another movie would have jumped away, would have turned it into a jump scare, like, oh, spooky face, bye. And Flanagan instead is just like, no, but look at it. Look at the spooky face. Look at it. And then I'm going to make you keep looking, because it's going to get uncomfortable now.
I love that. I love that about his stuff, you know. And where do you think he fits he's, I mean, an incredible run of films, right, from about 2014 onwards, basically almost every year, banger after banger. Where do you think he fits with the other great kind of horror voices of this last decade? Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, Julia Ducournau, these filmmakers that a lot of people use that bullshit term elevated horror, or kind of, I guess, more art house horror. Does Flanagan kind of fit alongside those people, would you say, in terms of like the big horror filmmakers at the moment?
Well, I don't think I would call him. I don't think I would call his work art house horror, but it is deeply creative and artistic and emotional. So it's not necessarily kind of what we imagine to be studio horror. What strikes me top of my head is actually that he's much more interested in the inner lives of his characters and his monsters than he is in the body and the grotesque.
Yes.
He's much more interested in faces and dialogue and their inner emotions, their memories, their past, than, someone like Ducournau or Ari Aster or Eggers are much more grounded in the thing that is happening right now, and much more grounded in the physicality of their characters as well. And I think Flanagan kind of his cinema feels like classic cinema, but transported into the horror genre. It's like when I look at his work, I'm seeing kind of this very creatively, almost politely made horror that feels like it belongs to right now, but could also perfectly fit in the 90s, in the early 90s, or like the 1940s almost. Like there's a classical element to it. It's not flashy.
Yeah,
but
right.
Every single film, and kind of having read a bunch of interviews with him, every single film is a creative challenge in a way. Like, we'll talk about Hush, and that came out of like, how can we do a scary horror film where the lead character cannot hear or speak? So you're taking away tools that are quite important for performers and for screenwriters.
Yeah.
And how do you make that effective? So it feels like with every single project he's done, he's sort of raising the ante for himself as a filmmaker to try and create dread and atmosphere and scares, but always trying to push his filmmaking forward.
Yeah, I think you're so right. He occupies this space, I think, where, like, again, thinking of filmmakers, current horror filmmakers, where you've got people like James Wan and Lee Whannell at one end of the spectrum that create that kind of very, like, mainstream, I guess, that kind of crowd-pleasing Ghost Train type horror. And then the other side where you've got like Eggers and Aster that make this more kind of art house horror. And Flanagan kind of sits somewhere in between those two, I think, doesn't he? And you're so right. Like there's something that feels classical, like unapologetically old school almost about his work, isn't there? Like, Spielberg, Hitchcock, even like 40s cinema to 60s cinema. Like it feels like all of that could fit in Flanagan's kind of world. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And also, the things that he manages, like you say, pushing himself experimentally with like, let's create a film without dialogue. For a man that loves a monologue, that's pretty impressive, right?
Yes, that's what I thought. Rewatching Hush, I'm like, oh, you've just been making up for all the lost monologues in Hush.
Yes, exactly. And then, I think he did achieved virtually the impossible, which was creating somehow a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and a sequel to Stephen King's The Shining, right?
Yes.
Like, how did he manage that? Unbelievable.
I mean, I remember watching that film and being like, how does this feel like it's not a flawless film, but the marriage between the King sensibility and the Kubrick sensibility, which are radically oppositional, is kind of mind-boggling. Like it did achieve something that I think everyone who's a fan of The Shining novel and film thought was just never going to happen.
Right. Yeah. I just kind of thought, oh, this is going to be an absolute mess. Like a film that's going to have to like please both camps. It's going to be a very like compromised work of art. And it didn't feel like that at all to me, and it still felt like a Flanagan film as well on top of all of that. So yeah, pretty amazing. But let's rewind back to the early days of Flanagan. So we're going to go to 2016. Let's kick things off with this like beautifully simple little home invasion banger, right? Hush.
So, a deaf-mute author by the name of Maddie, who has written a novel called Midnight Mass, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, is accosted in her house by an unnamed man who first kills her neighbor and then becomes intent on killing her too. And so begins a game of cat and mouse between them as she tries to survive and keep him out of her house and also to escape. And he just wants to murder her, basically.
Indeed. So this movie premiered at South by Southwest in 2016, and then it was released by Netflix, right? And this kind of marked the beginning of his sort of Netflix relationship, his Netflix era of films. What is your history with this, Anna? Do you remember when you first saw Hush, and what do you think of it generally?
I don't remember. I was trying to remember this. I don't remember when I first saw Hush. I definitely saw it around this time, so 2016, 2017. I remember loving it. I think I probably saw it perhaps on Netflix even, definitely on a laptop, not in a cinema. And it was inventive. That's how I felt about it at that time, and that's how I still feel about it. It has this beautiful simplicity of a low budget, high concept horror film, which I personally really dig.
Me too.
Let's do a horror film about a deaf character and someone gets into her home. And how would that change the home invasion format? How would that affect what she can do? How would that affect us as viewers? How would that change our relationship with this character who we're watching react to the scenario that we have seen play out over and over again, you know, and most of the times it ends with the person, the victim kind of getting slaughtered or being victorious. But there's always a lot of repartee, you know, when there's a cat and mouse type of situation, there's always a lot of, you know, talking between the persecutor and the victim. And that's not a possibility here. So that's kind of how I still see it. Yeah. Now, obviously, with the almost, 10 years that have passed since this movie was made, you've seen where Flanagan has gone as a filmmaker. But like I said before, the fact that he wanted to give himself this challenge, and Kate Seagull also, who co-wrote the screenplay as well as starring in the film, wanted to give herself that extra challenge as a performer as well, of not being able to use her voice to play this character. So it's obviously limited, but I love that about it because it's not trying to do something that it cannot do. It's pulling back to basics and in fact stripping away certain things and seeing what can come out of that.
Yeah, completely agree. I loved this movie too. I watched it on Netflix. I remember it. And this was like a really interesting era of movies coming out on sort of streaming platforms. Like these, like the way you said it, they're low budget, high concept movies, which I loved. Like the last couple of weeks on the podcast, we've talked about Karen Kusama's The Invitation and Joel Edgerton's The Gift. And these small, intimate thrillers or horrors set in the home that I really loved, and they were like there was a really good little run of them at this time. But of course, those other movies I just mentioned were so heavily reliant on dialogue, really, right, for the horror, whereas this movie just can't use that, and like that is in itself really interesting, right? Like I love that it is, like you said, it strips everything away. We get very little information about, what's really going on here, why this killer, this invader is doing what he's doing, like, and it just puts us in the moment, doesn't it? Like, that's it, just like in the here and now, almost real time across one night, and then it's just like in and out, under 90 minutes, banger, right? So good.
An 80-minute banger. And what I find quite interesting is that you're right, there is kind of an era there, and I actually associate it with the rise of Blumhouse, because he very famously kind of broke out into the horror mainstream with paranormal Paranormal Activity, another film that's kind of entirely set in a house, and then became a huge franchise. And these films and kind of that company's ethos was low budget, high concept, high reward. And shooting in a house was one of Blum's kind of rules for making a horror film on the cheap, but very effective. And there's also a large tradition of the house kind of in horror fiction, both literary and cinematic. So it's interesting that kind of at this time there was a rise in kind of, let's do low and mid-budget films. And a very straightforward way of doing that also taps into the genre is by just setting it in a house.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Blumhouse definitely did that with Paranormal Activity, even Insidious, right? I think James Wan and Lee Whannell's Insidious, I rewatched that recently, and 90% of that is obviously just set in a family's home as well. And it looks totally low budget, but it works so well in that regard, you know. So yeah, this movie it fits. And then obviously Gerald's Game does the same thing, but they fit really well in this little movement of movies. And how much do you think this kind of owes a debt to other home invasion movies that come before it as well? You know, because there's elements of it like The Mask. It reminds me a bit of The Strangers, of course. You know, you could
Halloween.
think about Halloween, of course. You could go back to movies like classic movies like Audrey Hepburn and Wait Until Dark, with this, like, you know, in that movie obviously it was a blind woman that was being targeted, but that's kind of like interesting similar themes, right? But where do you think this movie kind of fits in that sort of history of the home invasion?
Well, I've not been revisiting them in the same way as you have, Mike, but I was thinking about this and rewatching the movie. It sort of sits somewhere between a home invasion and a slasher and a survival horror, isn't it? Because the weird thing is that the man, as he's called, because he remains unnamed, gets into Maddie's house pretty early on, but then he's out. Like, she's stranded herself, barricaded herself in the house. He's not able to get in until much later on. And then it's more about her leaving the house than him coming in. Yeah. But it's then about her surviving. And this sort of relentless obsession with killing this random woman that he just stumbled upon is very much of the first Halloween vibe of, just gonna stabby my way through today, I guess. That's what's on the agenda. Yeah. There's no real motivation. There's no explanation. And that's fine. That works. And that was very deliberate on their part as well. Wait Until Dark was a direct influence on them as well, when they were thinking about this kind of idea of a deaf character, a deaf mute character, and how that would change the rules of the game. But it also kind of, I don't know, interestingly sits for me between survivalist horror and home invasion, just because of the amount of time that we actually spend with Maddie fighting back.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that the line obviously has always been quite blurry between home invasion and slashers, you know, because you mentioned Halloween. Like, Halloween is a home invasion movie, but of course we all call it a slasher. And I think, you know, The Strangers was a really interesting one to talk about, because The Strangers 2008 is basically, right, it was basically Funny Games. It's basically Them, the French movie Eel. It's like, it's almost those two, but instead what they did was they set it in an American setting. They put masks on the killers rather than like in Funny Games and Them. And suddenly it felt a bit more like a slasher movie than a home invasion movie. It's still a classic home invasion movie, but suddenly as soon as you put masks on the killers, there's something of it that then makes you think like you're watching a slasher movie, right? You know, there's like slasher iconography. Whereas, you know, with those kind of nastier home invasion movies like Funny Games and Them, even Panic Room, most of most of the home invasion movies that came previously to The Strangers, it was just a man. It's just like a guy or a group of people, and you know, like there's something almost a bit more everyday about it that makes it more frightening. Whereas putting those masks on the killers in The Strangers suddenly pushed it further into genre in a weird way, I think. You know? And Hush kind of does a bit of both, doesn't it? Because Hush, obviously we get the mask, but then he takes off the mask after the first act
super quickly.
Balance.
It kind of takes away the scare factor in a sense, because that mask is really creepy, especially when it's kind of reflected in the mirrors and behind him is just the darkness. When he takes it out, he's just like some dude. Yeah. He's just some dude with a half beard. And there's nothing special about him. Even as a killer. Like, who are you? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What's your weird obsession with this woman? Like, why are you killing? Why do you have a bow and arrow, Matt?
Right.
Like,
I know, exactly. There are so many questions about this man, right? So many questions.
I know, but it kind of unsettles us because it does that and then doesn't give us any answers. Like, it's just some dude.
Yes.
So you're right. It kind of sits in between these two extremes by reminding us of both, but then by upsetting the rules of both the subgenres.
Yeah, and I love that. And actually, I was reading some reviews, and apparently a lot of people were quite disappointed at that kind of first act demasking of the killer, and the fact that throughout the rest of the movie he doesn't wear that creepy mask. And a lot of people said that took away for them the fear and the horror, which I do find really interesting, because I don't know, there are different... It's scary in different ways, isn't it? Obviously, the mask in itself is scary in that it just looks uncanny and creepy. But also, I think there's something equally as scary about, like, oh, this is just a dude, like you said, and it's like, why is he and actually he seems kind of, apart from the fact that he's clearly psychotic, he actually seems fairly like normal and mundane in a way, and like,
oh, he seems so basic.
Yeah,
he's like a 6, maybe like a Hackney 5, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But that in itself can be quite scary, but a lot of people, I think, found that quite disappointing. It kind of took away his power, maybe, and takes away from the horror. I don't know, how do you find that decision to kind of demask the killer so early on?
I can see why it would be disappointing for some people. I didn't particularly feel the disappointment. It would be, I think it would be weirder to demask him and then have him put the mask back on again, because the mask actually has no significance.
No.
In the story. But then also narratively it's necessary, because in order to have any sort of repartee between them, his face needs to be visible so she can read his lips.
Yes. Yeah, that's
so it's point. Like it's a character choice, really. And because he is a nameless sadist, he wants her to listen to him. He's constantly trying to get her attention. He's constantly trying to get her to like watch his face, essentially listen to him. Not that what he's saying is particularly interesting or exciting or original. Like, oh, I'm gonna kill you. Woo. It's like, okay, fine, yes, and everybody fucking wants to kill me. Get in line, bitch. I think that it works as a character choice and as a narrative choice. I think that's what demands it.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that is what pushes it from just being a slasher movie into being then a home invasion movie, in a way that it is just these two people. It's like Panic Room. You've got one person inside, the other person outside trying to get in, and that's the movie, right, for the rest of the movie. But let's just rewind and talk a little bit about Maddie as well, and this Kate Seagull performance. Like you said, she's a longtime collaborator of Mike Flanagan. She's his partner in real life as well. She co-wrote this movie with him too, right? And she stars in it. It's basically her vehicle, this film, really, isn't it? Like, what do you think of her performance and her portrayal as Maddie in this?
So it's interesting watching Gerald's Game and Hush kind of back to back with one another. And Kate Seagull, I know, really wanted the role of Jessie in Gerald's Game, and even spoke of Hush as sort of her audition for Gerald's Game. I read in an interview that she was, really into the book. She really wanted to play that role. Watching her and Carla Gugino kind of in essentially similar overall, and not the same story, but kind of premises, a woman alone in a house.
Yeah, absolutely. Who basically has to sort of carry the whole movie with her singular performance, right?
Yeah, exactly. Kate, I found to be a very physical performer. Like, I think she's at her best when she's allowed to move and do stuff with her body. Like, she's amazing at stunts. She did all her own stunts in Hush. She's incredibly physical when you can read her when she's moving.
Yeah.
I don't think her strongest suits are close-ups.
Interesting.
In the sense that, like, I think, I'm not saying this is like disparaging of her physicality. She's obviously like a very beautiful woman. That's not the point. I think Carla Gugino, by contrast, everything of her performance is in the face.
Yes.
Like, her eyes, her mouth, like her skin, even the way that they kind of, adjust her skin as time goes on in Gerald's Game, and she becomes like dehydrated and just, blood rearranges itself at different extremities at different points. Anyway, we'll get to that. Yes. She's very much like a face actress, Yes. Again, not disparaging her like ability to perform with her body, but I think their strengths lie in different elements of their performances. So that's the thing that really struck me from rewatching both these films back to back.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I hadn't thought about that, because you're right. In some ways, they're very, very similar in what these two performances have to do, but in the other extreme, they're very different. One is dialogue free and is all physical, and the other one is no movement and is basically entirely reliant on talking and facial expressions, right? So
talking to herself,
exactly. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting. But yeah, I agree. I really like Kate Siegel, and I think maybe she's grown as an actor since. Like, I think she's really good in Midnight Mass and other stuff she's done with Flanagan over the years, right? And I'm always kind of surprised that she doesn't pop up in more stuff, really. Like, I only ever really see her in Mike Flanagan stuff, and I wonder if that's just her own choice, or if, for whatever reason, she just hasn't broken into the sort of the mainstream yet, or outside of that Flaniverse, It's interesting, isn't it?
I did read in the same interview that she really wants to play Ripley if there's ever an Alien remake, and I would love that for her. I think that would be such great casting.
Yeah, that would be great casting. Yeah, she's so good, and also there's just so much heart.
Yes.
That I don't know. And this comes in Mike Flanagan's writing, of course, and her writing for this movie, but there's something about her where I just want to root for Kate Siegel in every film she's in. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I want her to be protected at all costs in every role she's played in every Flanagan film. Do you know what
There's
I mean?
always like a glimmer of tragedy in her eyes. Yeah. Like, all her characters just have something that you're like, oh, honey.
Yes. There's almost a bit of sadness, isn't there, in every character she plays? Even the very, very tiny role that she has in Gerald's Game, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
There's this glint of sadness behind the eyes that she's really good at as well, that she sort of naturally has. Yeah. And what about this character of Maddie then? I mean, obviously, like, we're coming at this as two able-bodied people, right? But like, how do you find it, the portrayal of a deaf character here? Again, like, I don't know. I was thinking about this, about whether how much has changed over the last few years, where even now, I feel like if this was made in 2023, they would probably have cast a deaf actress, I imagine, to play this role, right? But how do you find it, the portrayal of this deaf character in this movie?
Well, her deafness isn't really the defining part of her, right? I think her isolation is. And I was thinking about this before, and I don't know. Because on the one hand, what I like about it is that the film does not make deafness the point. She's a deaf character. She can communicate very fluently and easily, both in sign language and by reading people's lips. Everything around her is like, adjusted to her needs. And that's never an issue. It becomes kind of the point of difference for this format of a home invasion. But we know the rules from the very beginning. But I do wonder about this thing of, because I'm not a deaf person and I don't know sign language, I quite liked the choice of leaving the parts at the beginning of the film where she's signing unsubtitled. I don't know if it was just a weird copy that I was watching, but they were unsubtitled, and I like that, because sign language is a language. And much like it is a creative choice by a filmmaker to leave certain portions of a film subtitled or unsubtitled if they're not being performed in the language that the rest of the film is made. Yes. I'm a big fan of kind of like films and subtitles being a creative choice as well. Yeah. So that I dug. But that said, outside of kind of the conversation that was happening couple of years ago when Coda won the Best Picture award and, the Best Actor award, the first time a deaf actor had won, the way that disability has been portrayed in film and in horror film continues to be a sticking point. But what I like about Hush, and I might be wrong-footed about this, absolutely, fair game, if I am, is that Hush does not present it as a disability. It is an element of her life, and then we move on with the story. It's not the thing that makes Maddie. Maddie is a writer. Maddie has issues communicating with people. Maddie feels isolated, and Maddie struggling with the ending of her novel. But the deafness element of it is almost context for who she is, as opposed to the thing she is.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I think, again, I might be wrong, but from my perspective, it doesn't feel sort of patronizing in a way. Like, and we've talked about this a lot. Me and Alexandra Helen Nicholas talked about the Spiral Staircase from the 1940s. Very similar, again, about a mute woman who is targeted in her home by an invader. And obviously, it's very much of its time. It's so old now, that film, and it does have this kind of element of, oh, she's cured at the end of her, you know, she just needs a man to come in and help her, and she's cured of her, of being mute. And similarly in Wait Until Dark, you know, again, like Audrey Hepburn is slightly infantilized in that film as well, and in the way that she's portrayed as a character. And I just don't think there's any of that in this. Like, I think you're right. Like, it's not, it's a part of who she is, but it's not really about that in a way. And she's like, they, you know, again, like, the writing is so great, I think, and that Flanagan and Seagull like give this character, she's got a career, she's dating, she's got friends, she's got her own shit going on, you know, like, and it's not, and also she's super tough. Like, obviously it all comes down to her choosing not to run, not to hide, but to fight, right? And to use what she knows to her advantage as well. So yeah, I think all of that's really interesting. And it is really interesting how much has changed just in the years since. Like you said, Coda winning Best Picture. I also thought about A Quiet Place from 2018, of course.
Oh,
as well,
yes.
Where you have
of course.
Where you have Millicent Simmons, the deaf actress who plays the daughter in that, obviously, as well. So, but yeah, I wondered too about the subtitles, because in the copy I had too, there were no subtitles when she was signing, and I was trying to remember. I ended up turning them on just so I wasn't missing anything. And it was subtitling what she was saying. And I couldn't remember whether in the original version I watched, because it's not on Netflix anymore, but back on Netflix, whether that they gave her subtitles or not. I can't quite remember now. But it's kind of interesting watching it without. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's... again, we could be completely wrong, but I think it's great. I think she's a really, like, fully fleshed character, right? And again, like... there's a sadness to her, but I don't think it's to do with her deafness, right? She's a lonely person. She's clearly like, she's not seen her family in however long, and they kind of build all of this up about her. But it's more that she's just like this reclusive writer than anything else, right?
Totally.
How often have you done, when you sit down to write, Anna, the whole like... blah, 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 ending, blah, 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 and all that stuff that she does.
I am, as you know, in the process of writing another book, and I am very much in my Maddie era of just, la, 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 you're shit at this. Words will come if you stay here long enough. They will come. I'm sure they will.
Yes. Yes. So then, of course, but it's not long before the horror kicks off. I think one of the scariest parts of the film for me is when her friend, played by Samantha Sloyan, is being murdered outside the door behind her, right?
Oh, yeah.
She's unaware of it. Holy shit. Like, that's a really effective moment, I think.
Yeah, totally. Totally. And it's it being right there, and then like someone not realizing that it's happening right there.
So good. How do you find it from this point onwards? Like, the horror gets going, and that's it all the way through to the end, right? It's just this like relentless pursuit, this cat and mouse pursuit. How do you find it? Do you think that Flanagan does a good job of kind of keeping up that momentum all the way through to the end from this point onwards?
Yeah, I think so. The only thing that I remember kind of the only thing that I forgot that kind of did not work for me so much this time is the one moment when we see inside of Maddie's character and we kind of hear her voice. Yeah. And we hear her sort of imagine the different variations of what could happen if she did X, or if she did Y, if she did Z, or whatever. Yeah. That's the only moment where I was like, oh, you're taking me out of the tension. you're letting off steam, and I don't want a lot of steam yet. I want to see where this ends. But I think he's very good at kind of creating, outside of that moment, which didn't work for me, just because it seemed like a cop out from the premise of the entire film. He's very good at kind of leaving us little moments to catch our breath, like when she's plotting, when she's healing the wound on her leg, and also interestingly when we go outside of her and we see the man kill the neighbor's boyfriend as well, and see how he reacts to kind of an outside intervention of someone else coming in to snoop around in his business.
That's an interesting scene, isn't it? Because it's sort of, you know that neighbor is not going to survive that. But also, there is something that, it's a very deliberate choice, isn't it? That, like you said, this killer character is pretty basic. He's pretty weak. And even in comparison to that neighbor who's quite big built, and, you know, I think the killer calls him a jock and stuff, right? Like, you get like, he is like, the killer is physically smaller and overpowered by that other guy.
I mean, we're projecting a lot of insecurity on him, Michael.
But it's true, right? Like, I think it's a very deliberate choice that they cast that neighbor as like a guy that is like much physically bigger than him and is kind of more confident than him in a way, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
I did not make notes about that, but I'm glad that you did.
Yeah, just my little observation there. What about the house itself? Obviously, like in Home Invasion, the actual geography of the space is so important, and the house itself. We've seen everything from, like, you know, New York City houses like in Panic Room to kind of little apartments in Wait Until Dark to like houses in the middle of nowhere. What do you think of this particular space that we spend our entirety of the film in?
Well, I think I already mentioned my disdain for doors, for the abundance of doors.
Yes.
And my main thing is, this house has too many doors. Why is everything a fucking sliding door? Why do you need so many entry points? I think that was the scariest element for me. The fact that the house has kind of these windows that go from like top to bottom windows, and the sliding doors are all windows with what do you call it? Wooden paneling on the side.
Yeah.
So that element, the fact that you can see outside and people can see in very clearly, is the thing that elevates the sense of dread, especially at the start when we see stuff happening from the inside, but Maddie still hasn't clocked it. That's what really works. And you couldn't do that kind of in a more traditional, less open house where it's wood and you cannot see through it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, like, this is something that I've noticed more and more as well. So much of Home Invasion, of course, is usually set around affluent homes, affluent families. Like, and, you know, some movies comment on that. There are movies like Us and Parasite that are very much about class, right? Even The Purge. But what is it with, like, rich people's homes that have so much glass? Like, so it's just like think of the house in Parasite that's almost entirely glass and stuff. Like, this idea that everyone can see in but no one can see out kind of thing, you know? But yeah, it makes
especially kind of in a forest or something like that, where, you know, people can look in but also technically there's no one else around, but that is a big assumption that there's no one else around.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, like, yeah, I also want the nature views, but also if someone shows up in that scenario,
gone.
I'm gone. Never to set foot in a fucking park ever again.
Exactly that. So there you go. How do you find it wraps up? Like, again, like that kind of empowering moment when she stabs the killer repeatedly, right, and everything. Like, does it come to a satisfying conclusion for you?
Well, was there ever going to be another option, is what I'll say.
You never know, do you? You know, again, the strangers win, you know? Like, but again, like, that's where this movie is different, isn't it? I think. Yeah.
I think it is so with Maddie that there was no way that she would have not won. And I think, you know, even that sentimentality that we spoke about earlier that Flanagan has really comes through, especially in the sort of note that she leaves her parents, you know, the "I died fighting, love you,
yeah,
I died fighting."
Yeah.
It's very... that never left us any other option.
Yeah.
And also, now we know what her new book is going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I love the midnight mass Easter eggs in this.
Oh yes,
well.
me too.
So good.
You know where that happened? It's because Midnight Mass was Flanagan's like big personal passion project, right? He was writing it for years, even before he showed it to anyone. And he wanted to make sure that it ended up in a movie somehow, because he just did not believe that it would ever get made.
Yeah.
So he, as a kind of little personal Easter egg, he made it a part of the novel that Maddie had written. And the files that Kate Seagull was working on in the film are actually the scripts, the unfinished scripts for Midnight Mass that he'd had written.
So good.
Yeah.
So good. I love this idea that
So
there's this
good.
big universe of Flanagan as well, and that they all connect.
The Flaniverse!
So good. Well, there we go. We should move on, but that was the brilliant Hush from 2016. Stacey, am I right in thinking you've got a bit of a background in acting? You used to tread the boards?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes,
lovely.
Mike, I have accents are my specialty, as you can see. By the end of it, I'm saying, yeah, Demi, why did you do that to her?
Why you do that to her, damn man?
They're all gonna laugh at you.
They're all gonna laugh at you. I can see your dirty pillows.
They're called breasts, Mama, and every woman has them.
Those were some clips you just heard there from my discussion with friend of the pod, Stacey Ponder, because earlier this week on Patreon, we dropped part 1 of our top 50 horror performances of all time countdown. Stacey joined me as we revealed the results of this year's Patreon poll. Several hundred patrons all submitted their top 10 horror performances of all time. We collated the results, put together the top 50, and we have began revealing the results. The list is great. The conversation I had with Stacey was great, and if you want to listen to the first part of that top 50, it's available right now, and the second half, in which we reveal the final 25, will be out in the next week or two. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. That top 50 countdown will be available to $5 donors, along with our monthly Fresh Blood episodes. Or you can sign up at a $10 level, where you will get access to absolutely everything, a whole back catalogue of over 200 bonus episodes, and access to our exclusive retrospectives and mini-seasons. Everybody who signs up will also get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of October a little thank you. So a big thank you to Tara Dayton, Andrew Wright, Alison Hardenberg, Lewis Jones, Harry Minogue, Phil Sear, Alex Sestock, Emiliana Wilbert, Jake Pope, Jessica Stacey, Chris Wyke, Thomas Fortune, Megan Quinn, Zalico Nice, John Cooper, Max Beecher, Matthew Carroll, Emma Fowler, Claire Knight, Wendy Larson, Rebecca Cleaver, Jacob Douglas, Miko, Gareth Horrocks, Rachel Thomas, Jill Zavisa, Laura P, Claire Mitchell, Morgan A. Colbert, Jordan Shelton, Alex Chow, Ben Stubbs, Edward Penry, Adam B, Paul Hansen, Claire Allure, Torgeir Harsvik, Robin, Evan Casto, Wayne Davis, Nick Wall, B, Omid Furamazi, Krusty Kamikaze, Ross Kavanagh, Keith MVOSF, Jacob Inman, Mia Franz, Jamie Martinez, Jennifer Summers, Joel C, Alex Garrick Wright, Michael Turner, Brian Tyler, Tony Greamer, Moose Wilson, Aaron Griffin, Christopher Jansen, Amanda Bishop, Brittany Wilkes, Pete, Neil Wimperney, Holly Goblin, Wes Langford, Anne Bergerstedt, Lane Johnson, Pete Brown, Apocalyptica, Jules Stone, Daniel Fries, Patrick Zielsberger, KD Wolf, Jack Stiles, Rich Gabe, Kate, Catherine Hicks, Casey, Northern Loon, June Coates, Alex GW, John Paul Ferreter, Levi, Inez Achega Leitao, Catherine, Laura Lassiter, Aaron Madden, Billy Goodhart, Michelle Jitterbug, Stephanie Kim, Rose Sinclair, and Reed. A huge thank you to all of those people who signed up to our Patreon in the spooky month of October. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as Anna Bogutskaya and I delve into our next Mike Flanagan film, Gerald's Game, from 2017.
I bet you think your husband will be back any minute. Try to go for him. There's no one for miles.
Gerald?
I'm sorry, baby. You don't get to know my name.
I don't like this. I'm serious. Stop.
Like that.
Stop it!
Are you playing?
Is this really what it takes these days?
God, how did we go so wrong? We were happy once, weren't we?
Gerald? What? What's happening?
Oh.
Gerald!
Wake up. Just wake up. It's time to wake up, honey.
5 hours you've wasted screaming for neighbors that are half a mile away, if they're even here yet. How long do you think someone lives without water? That will not work. You can pull till your wrists break. You're not getting out of those cuffs.
You're not real. You're not real.
So, let me paint you a picture. An affluent marriage is in trouble. Even though they have all the money in the world and all the abs in the world, and they have a beautiful lake house, they're having issues. So they go to the lake house, they take their Viagra to spice up their marriage, try a little handcuffing. Unfortunately, things do not go according to plan, and Gerald has a heart attack mid-argument. And his wife, Jessie, played by Carla Gugino, ends up handcuffed to the bed in just her silk slip dress. And with that, very far away, too far away from her phone, the keys to the handcuffs, or anything else. So she's stranded alone with the corpse of her husband, a dog that she tried to feed Wagyu beef to, Kobe beef to, I'm sorry. And a real or maybe not real intruder into the house whose eyes glimmer in the moonlight and who has a bag full of bones and trinkets that he loves to show off.
Absolute nightmare fuel, that guy. What a film, right? Just the most unsuccessful attempt at spicing up your sex life you could possibly make, right? I think this is really, really awful. Anna, tell me about your relationship with this movie. What do you think of it?
Well, do you know what? I actually have a really funny story about this one. I was after rewatched the film, I went on the wiki for it, and in the first paragraph, it mentioned it had its world premiere at the BFI South Bank in 2017. I actually organized that world premiere.
Of course you did.
Yeah, way back when it was the Stephen King season, and I was doing all the events for it, and I was a Flana fan already, and I watched this film very early on by myself in a private screening, absolutely lost my shit. We got to play it. It was one of the earliest things that we played in partnership with Netflix, and they flew out Mike Flanagan just for that day for a Q&A.
Wow. And
I was sick or somewhere, and I couldn't actually be there on that night.
No.
But that was me. I did that.
So when you finally got
was
to
wonderful.
see it, Anna, what did you think of the film?
Oh, well, I got to see it early because I was doing that thing.
Oh, of course.
So I had seen it already, obviously, but I hadn't rewatched it in a while. Mm-hmm. And it was so interesting to revisit it because it is so kind of like an embryonic version of everything that Flanagan would do later on with Bly Manor, with Hill House, with Midnight Mass, with the Midnight Club, even with Dr. Sleep.
Yeah.
Like, it is so a Carla Gugino special.
Yeah.
It is so kind of, and this is the thing that didn't quite work for me this time around. It's so the trauma plot that has now become the de facto go-to. And I know this is the novel. Okay, this is not Flanagan's design. This is what's in the book. But it is incredibly striking to me how he could sustain tension for a whole 90 minutes, with the most of that film being set in a bed with one woman.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of incredible.
It's an astonishing... I agree with you. It's not perfect, this film. Like, I think there are flaws in it. And I think you're right, actually. A lot of those flaws might be the Stephen King text. I mean, Stephen King, I love him, but he does love all of his female characters to have some sort of trauma, right? Like, whether it's Bev Marsh in It, or Carrie White, or Margaret White. Like, every female character,
everyone.
Basically.
I would say the male characters as well. Everyone is traumatized in a Stephen King novel.
Everyone is traumatized.
Trauma for everyone.
Exactly,
It is, I think... I'm personally a little bit oversaturated with the trauma plots.
Yes.
But this film is 2017, so it's not right now. It's just
it's pre-trauma.
Yeah. It's pre that. And it does obviously, like deal with child sexual assault in a pretty direct way. And again, like I mentioned before, this coterie of actors that he works with, Bruce Greenwood, who plays Gerald, Henry Thomas, who's had a role in almost every single Flanagan thing since this, I think, is really fantastic as Jessie's dad, who not only assaults her, but then in what is truly the most grotesque scene of the film, convinces her to keep it a secret and kind of makes it all feel like her fault. And that guilt and that repression kind of very much is the linking of both the young Jessie that we see in flashbacks and the older Jessie, who allows herself not just to be in a marriage with Gerald, who's a fucktard, but also to be put in this position and then have to like push herself physically, psychically in order to escape. Yeah,
it is icky, this film, isn't it? It's like he for such a simple story, and again, this is something that Flanagan has kind of done so interestingly throughout his career, like him pushing himself, like we said, the kind of experimental almost nature of Hush, to then making this what was classified as an unfilmable book, right, with Gerald's Game, to then doing the impossible that we've already talked about with Dr. Sleep. Like, he keeps achieving these kind of like near impossible tasks, it feels like. And like he uses every trick in the book to make us feel tense, scared, grossed out, uncomfortable, icked out, if that's even a phrase, but like it's like everything, right? It's like creepy men in the corner, it's dogs eating people's faces, it's body horror with degloving, it's the most awkward attempt at a sex scene I've ever seen in my life, to the horrible sexual assault. Like it throws every
it's the
trick.
Wasting of good meat on a stray dog.
Exactly.
Kobe beef, $200 a slice.
This movie.
Throw it the fuck away.
Honestly,
Jesus.
The first time I saw this was only the second time I'd ever seen it, and the first time I watched it, I watched it with Rihanna, who has never forgiven me. Like, she thought this was one of the most upsetting and traumatizing films she's ever watched. I've never seen her be so affected by a horror movie ever as with Gerald's Game. Like, I don't know why, like, something just, it really got her, this movie. I think just like the whole scenario of this woman being left by herself and just how relentless it is. It just goes on, doesn't it? And gets worse and worse for her in a way. And the bit that really freaked her out, and freaked me out the first time I saw it actually, is the first time you see the Moonlight Man in the corner of the room, right? When he like slowly becomes visible. I think that they show a bit too much of him later on in the film, but that first glimpse you get of him is that classic Mike Flanagan horror, isn't it? It's like squint and you might see a figure in the corner of a room, you know? Love that.
That's so interesting, because the first thing that really freaked me out was actually the dog. So like before the dog starts chomping away at Gerald, it just appears in the doorway. And when I first watched the film, I was like, oh, shit. Oh, no. Because that is scary.
So scary. Yeah.
That is scary. You can't, like, negotiate with a dog. No. You can't just be, oh, well, here's, my trinket, Moonlight Man.
No.
If the dog wants to eat your face and you're handcuffed to the bed, it's going to eat your face.
Yeah, it's scary. That's another thing that we've seen a lot of in these home invasion movies is scary dogs, actually. Like, we've had the people under the stairs, Don't Breathe.
Yeah.
There's a couple of others too. But yeah, like always like scary guard dogs and scary wild dogs and that kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, I agree with you on that as well. Absolutely. Because right, it's set up to be like, it ate the steak. It's got this taste for meat and blood. And then you've got this dead body that it's going to chomp on. And it's like, shit, it's going to come for her next, you know? Yeah.
Well, you know, the thing about the Moonlight Man that always got me, and definitely got me this time round as well, is that you don't know until the very end whether he's real or not. Like, is he an apparition or is he a real person? And because he does look like a lot of the Flanagan ghosts.
Yes.
You know, or at least, again, I'm talking about this in reverse. In Hill House, afterwards, you do kind of get the Flanagan ghost a lot. And I think the Moonlight Man is kind of the first iteration of it, where you're sort of like, is this a real person? Or is this a ghost? Because Flanagan's ghosts are real people.
Right.
They're always kind of the in-between of, is this person alive or are they not? Because, you know, he employs actors, they're made up, but it's kind of very subtle makeup. Like, this could be a real person who's just pale.
Yeah.
And I love that. This is one of the first instances of that.
I agree. You're right about what you said about how this is like the embryonic. It's like this is when Flanagan really arrives, right? As like we sort of are starting to get what his thing is with this film for sure. And Carla Gugino, you've mentioned it already, but what do you think of her in this? It's basically an entire film that is
Carla
her
Gugino,
film, right?
One of the most beautiful faces to ever be put on the screen. Like, cannot deal with her. And I think she's almost been sort of undermined by how beautiful she is. In that way that a lot of beautiful actresses have just been sort of cast as arm candy and like hot people and not really characters. She's gotten to do a lot more stuff as she's gotten older. Again, not disparaging her, like I'd sell my soul to look at Carla Gugino in her 50s. But she has like she not only has like one intense role, she's playing several things. She's playing different versions of Jessie. As, you know, the Jessie that we see with Gerald at the start, the Jessie that we see kind of as she deteriorates and becomes kind of more nervous, more afraid. And the Jessie at the end of the film as well. So she has to go through this physical and emotional roller coaster with this character, while again, kind of that limitation for a performer of having to be kind of prostrated on this bed. And essentially, you know, visually, she's talking to an apparition, like her mental projection of Gerald. She's talking to her memory of herself, a projection of herself. In the novel, these are kind of different characters. So they're not kind of played by the same actress, so to speak. It's not the same voice. She's imagining different people from her past. But again, this is why I think Mike Flanagan is one of the great adapters of literature, of art, of horror cinema ever, because he does think filmically about these things and he thinks in terms of performance. So he gives Carla Gugino this opportunity to play against herself. Effectively, narratively, she's monologuing. She's not even monologuing. She's thinking shit in her head. Yeah. But because that would be impossible to watch on screen, deeply boring, he makes it into a show off between her and her. Yeah. So it's kind of a precursor as well to stuff that, you know, we've seen it a number of times when the same actor plays two roles kind of playing off against each other. But most recently, we've seen it with Rachel Weisz in Dead Ringers, where she's doing Rachel Weisz v. Rachel Weisz. And it's kind of wonderful to observe. And because the Jessie that we see that is kind of her projection of herself is so much more self-assured and calm, whereas real Jessie is freaking out and losing her shit. Yeah. It's it's essentially like two radically different performances that she's giving.
Yeah. Did you find because did that work for you then in the way in which like we have to spend so much of the time with these kind of inner monologues via these two extra characters, right? You mentioned that it didn't work for you quite so much with that moment in Hush with Kate Seagull kind of talking to herself, right? But does this kind of work better for you in the way that he utilizes it in this movie?
Yes. Again, I think it's like he would perfect the Flanagan monologue later on.
Yeah.
But the problem I have with the Hush one is because if she's been deprived of her voice, she's never heard her voice. We don't know what she speaks. And I think like giving us a sample of that at the end is kind of a cop-out of the ruling principle of the film.
Yeah.
Whereas here, that doesn't apply. And like I said, Carla Gugino also kind of speaks differently when she's kind of in the projection Jessie versus when she's the handcuffed Jessie.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the body horror in this. Because again, like, I could not believe how effective, even on rewatch, the degloving scene is, to the point where I almost actually had to look away. And I'm not usually that squeamish, but there's something about hand trauma, and Mike Flanagan fucking loves hand trauma, right? I don't know what it is about it, but there's something about it. It's like you can feel that moment as she peels her hand off through those handcuffs. But yeah, how do you find that? Like, I guess just how visceral this movie is with the chomping of the dog and the degloving and the glass and all those other moments that make it feel so kind of grotesque.
The funniest thing is when you sent me the questions for this and it was just degloving scene. That was the thing. I remember very viscerally watching this in that screening room when I watched the film for the first time, and I was like chomping at my own hands.
Yeah.
And rewatching it, I knew it was coming, but holy fucking shit. Do you know what it is for me? It's her performance. It's not even the hand, because the CGI is not super great.
No.
With the tendons and the skin and the slicing and stuff.
Yeah.
But oh my god, Carla Gugino sells it.
Yes.
So her whimpering, her yelling, her screaming, but also trying to contain, like, regulate her breathing so she doesn't make herself pass out accidentally. That's the thing that just got under my skin. It's not the skin peeling itself, it's the under the skin. And then, because I have also accidentally cut my hand really bad years ago when I was opening a can of tuna, it was not very dramatic, but I remember like the thing that's really scary that like literally made me nauseous was the moments directly after when she has to get up and she knows that she cannot stop.
Yes.
And her hand is like shaking because she's probably cut through some nerves and shit. And it's like she cannot use it. And she's trying to lift the key with her hand, with the bad hand, to try to open the other thing. And her hand is like trembling like this.
Yes.
Oh my
That's so
god.
good.
And
So
I remember
good.
like I got this sensory memory of trying to stop the bleeding in my hand when I cut myself. And I actually passed out on top of in the bathroom because it was like an accidentally like quite a deep gash.
Oh god.
And I remember this feeling of like, no, just like focus. You cannot pass out. That's the dangerous part.
Yeah.
And like trying to stop it. And that's what she does. Like she wraps her hand up in like maxi pads. You know, she's trembling, just trying to remain conscious and keep moving. That thing made me sick to my stomach.
It's horrendous.
Because it's the direct after effect. And the fact that you know, and she knows, we all know that if she does not make it out of that house, she's fucking dead.
Yes.
Despite all of that.
You're right. It's everything that follows it. That moment, you really feel it, don't you? That moment when she's driving and she swerves and she's like, no, come on, just a little bit further. And you know, you just want her to get away because she's, there's any moment she could pass out, that's it, game over, she's dead basically, right?
Exactly.
And it is like that performance, you're absolutely right, just really carries the kind of the nausea of that whole sequence. It's so good. it's a difficult film to watch. I find these kind of survivalist horrors difficult to watch. It reminds me of movies like Buried with Ryan Reynolds, or 127 Hours when he has to cut through his hands, the Danny Boyle film. Like those movies where it's like, oh, okay, one person just stuck, and how are they going to get out of it, you know? And this is a really good version of that. But how do you find it? The thing that I sort of forgot about is that it doesn't end when she gets away. There's like a further 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, there's an epilogue.
Yeah, there's an epilogue, and where we get quite a lot of exposition via a monologue, right? This reminds me of the end of Bly Manor a bit, like this big, long voiceover telling you what's happened since, right? What do you think of it, what comes afterwards with the big explanation about the Moonlight Man and everything else?
Well, the Moonlight Man is a metaphor, right, for all the men in Jesse's life. The thing I remember the epilogue because I remember it from the first time, be like, oh, okay.
Yes.
The thing I like is that we get a kind of a definitive explanation for the Moonlight Man. In a way, I'd be like, oh, it would be so much nicer. And I'm sure I would have loved it if we never knew whether the Moonlight Man was a real thing or an actual or a ghost or an apparition. He still serves as a metaphor for all, and this is a book thing, he serves as a metaphor for all the men in her life who have always taken advantage of her and abused her with her kind of tacit allowance, because she's still carrying the gaslighting and the manipulation by her dad. And that final moment of, you know, you seem so small to me now, is her confronting that past. It's a bit sentimental. I don't think I can see why it's necessary, but it also kind of deflates the movie a little bit for me. Yeah. But at the end of the day, good for Jessie. You know, she got all that money. Has a foundation. She confronted her fears, and the Moonlight Man, tick, 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 all the boxes.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if like it's such a great ending, you know, when she drives into that tree, and there's just everything is red. It's this beautiful sequence where she's kind of getting, you know, washed over by the light of the eclipse. So kind of her memory and her present is collapsing onto one another. And we just get this very close up shot of the Moonlight Man saying mouse to her. You're like, was he there? Was he not there? Again, it's like a great gray area. So it's a bit of a deflated ending for me, although I end up just being like, okay, great, so this is a fairy tale, it's a wrap-up ending for Jessie.
It's kind of emotionally quite a satisfying ending, right? And this is what he loves an emotionally satisfying ending where all of our characters' feelings come out and everything is kind of resolved in one way or another. And we'll see this, like you said, again, this is the perfect kind of starting point to what we see in the last episode of Hill House, in the last episode of Bly Manor, like this kind of big emotional, and this is the stuff that some people have a problem with his work, right? And agreed, I think it would have been a more horrific, tight experience had we just ended after she'd driven away or crashed the car or whatever, but I don't mind it. In some ways, I was so traumatized by the degloving.
You needed
a few minutes to breathe, you know? I was just like, oh, thank God you're okay, Carla.
I think that's why it's there, to be honest. I think it's a bit of a like, okay, well, you can have a few minutes now to chill out.
Yes.
Let's come back down. Because that was a lot. I know that was a lot.
Oh, God, it was a lot. And we should talk about the other character, because it's really a two-hander, right? You've got Carla Gugino, but then you've also, of course, got Gerald, played by Bruce Greenwood, right? Flanagan regular, Bruce Greenwood. What do you make of Gerald as a character?
I've got several points.
Please.
Point number one, Bruce Greenwood. What is he on? Because a man that age with those abs, what is happening?
That's mental.
What? It's insanity.
Yes.
Second of all, fuck Gerald.
Yes.
Absolutely. Fuck him back to hell. Fuck their marriage. Gerald needs to do some goddamn reading and less sit-ups so that if he wants to get into like a bit of light, middle-class BDSM with some handcuffs, he needs to buy the right kind of handcuffs and not create this dangerous situation. Yes. And also needs to read up a little bit about some fucking consent, because there's several moments where she's like, no, stop, I don't want this. And he's like, oh, kinky. No, Gerald. No means no.
Yeah.
So like he is
not a good guy.
Fuck him. He is like, we don't get that much of him aside from the fact that he's a douchebag. And, you know, she clearly understands why she married him for comfort.
Yes.
But there is, you know, Bruce Greenwood is one of these like exceedingly handsome men who's very good at playing handsome douchebags. And he does get, I seem to remember that we didn't get to see much of him in the rest of the film. And I was pleasantly kind of like, oh no, yeah, he comes back as an apparition. He is constantly taunting her and talking to her and beating her down even after he's dead. So I think, you know, it doesn't go deep into their marriage and it doesn't need to. We get enough of Gerald in just the 5 minutes that we see him clothed and unclothed.
Yeah, completely agree. And like you mentioned already, but the different types of kind of monstrous men in this, I suppose, from Gerald as the kind of like pushy husband to obviously the predatory dad played by Henry Thomas, to then the out and out monster that is killing people and doing things to their dead bodies.
But doesn't touch Jesse.
But doesn't touch Jesse. That's interesting too, right? That he goes for men and not women, I think they said.
He only goes for men, which is why Gerald's face is all like chewed up and shit. It's not just the dog, it's the Moonlight Man.
Oh, I love it.
And I don't know, maybe the extras, if we ever get Gerald's Game on Blu-ray, will be the cut up, like the deleted scene of the Moonlight Man having his way with Gerald.
I'd love that.
Showing him a little bit about consent after his death.
Perfect. So we are going to wrap up on Gerald's Game shortly, but first of all, let's head on over to this week's Wild About Horror, because of course psychoanalyst and Freudian cinephile Mary Wild has plenty of thoughts on Mike Flanagan's Gerald's Game.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Mike Flanagan's psychological horror thriller film Gerald's Game, based on Stephen King's long thought to be unfilmable novel of the same name. A married couple arrives at an isolated house for a romantic getaway. Jesse changes into a new slip, and Gerald, after taking Viagra, restrains her with a set of police-grade handcuffs locked to the bedposts. He begins to enact a stranger rape fantasy. She half-heartedly plays along initially, but is quickly distressed, asking him to stop and to uncuff her. After a heated row in which he accuses her of not even trying to rekindle their passion, Gerald collapses and dies of a heart attack. A few hours pass. Jesse hallucinates that Gerald gets up and talks to her while his body remains on the floor. She also projects a more self-aware and assertive version of herself who explains things that she never had the clarity to face. Jesse falls asleep, wakes up in the dark, and sees a deformed figure in the corner of the room who reveals a bag of bones and trinkets. She refuses to believe that he's real. Gerald's spectre says that the obscured form is death waiting to take her. In her mind, Gerald refers to Jesse as Mouse, which triggers a memory of her father Tom, who called her by that nickname. When she was 12, her father had her sit on his lap while he masturbated to her during a solar eclipse. He gaslighted Jesse afterward to cover up the abuse, manipulating her to stay silent and never speak of the horrific incident. Alone in the room, Jesse smashes a water glass, cuts her wrist, and peels back the skin, allowing her blood-soaked hand to slip through the cuff. She's then able to reach the key and unlock her other hand. The so-called Moonlight Man is at the end of the hall. She removes her wedding ring and gives it to him for his trinket bag before leaving, like paying a toll to cross a border. 6 months later, Jesse writes a letter to her 12-year-old self. Her sleep has been restless since the awful ordeal. She learns from the news that a necrophile serial killer and grave robber called Raymond Andrew Joubert has been apprehended and standing trial. Turns out, Joubert was the real-life home invader that Jesse mistook for the hallucinated Moonlight Man. Jesse shows up at the criminal's arraignment, She approaches him in the courtroom and perceives the features of Gerald and her father Tom over top of Joubert. She triumphantly declares, "You're so much smaller than I remember," and leaves. I've already spoken in the Rear Window segment about the psychological structure of obsessional neurosis and Freud's Ratman case study, in which the subject is stuck in a dire state of ambivalence and procrastination, unable to act. For Gerald's Game, I want to focus on the mortified feature of the neurotic individual. Mortified both in the sense of being deeply humiliated and also undead, almost giving the impression of an animated corpse. My reading of Jessie is that her subjectivity is depleted. She's detached, puts up a front, and merely goes through the motions of what is expected of her. Being chained to a bed conjures up a hostage metaphor in which Jessie's autonomy is vitally suppressed and her survival depends on appeasing her abductor. As long as she remains in this lifeless position, she abnegates her own liberation. In psychoanalytic terms, Jessie is libidinally divested. Childhood trauma limits her to a mindset of crushing the life instinct. Freud said that the libido fixates on different erogenous zones during psychosexual development. Failure to adapt to the demands of various stages results in energy becoming dammed up, producing pathological character traits in adulthood. Psychotherapy addresses where repression might be taking place, allowing drives to be met directly, freeing up energy for conscious use in sublimation. Importantly, conscious reprocessing needs to take place for the subject to become libidinally invested again. Gerald's ghost taunts Jessie, remarking, quote, "You were chained to that bed for so many hours. You did what you always do when it gets too much. You ran in here." He gestures at her head. "You just laid here, calling my name again and again, and let critical time tick by. You should have been thinking about life support. You're a life support system, but you've been unplugged. There's still juice in there, but the charge is running down. And if you don't get out of the cuffs, it'll go all the way to zero." End quote. Jessie displays a lifelong pattern of avoidant behavior, shutting down her senses and mentally checking out when the going gets tough. The Lacanian idea of mortification applies here, as her impulse to turn away causes her to leak out conscious life. She strikes me as an escape artist, but strictly in the sense of zoning out, her life pasted together in a haphazard way. But there's still a part of herself that preserves survival and fights back by telling home truths. Her projected self tells Jessie, quote, "This is you all over. Problem, panic, denial. Hoping if you look away, it'll magically vanish. If you don't wake up, you're gonna die in those handcuffs. And we both know you've been sleepwalking since you were 12 years old. You married an older man. Your father was a lawyer. Gerald was a lawyer. Your father minimized you, objectified you. Jessie, you married into the only dynamic you've ever known. You were a girl, he was a man, and you never walked away from that. That afternoon never ended." End quote. Jessie's ideological collusion with her abuser is so severe that she inadvertently takes for granted the terms of Gerald's sex game, exchanging her dad's chains for Gerald's cuffs. These depraved men are aroused by taking advantage of her. It's like a ritualized mortification, conceptually speaking, the eroticization of the corpse. Sexual excitement is found in a form of abjection where Jessie is violently cast out of the interpersonal dynamic, appearing as neither subject nor object. Mortification as a signifier of death is strikingly pertinent to Joubert, who breaks into crypts, mausoleums, and cemeteries, stripping corpses of jewelry. He gouges out eyes and cuts the throats of corpses, removing their noses, hands, and ears. These are, respectively, sites of the 5 bodily senses: vision, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. Symbolically, Jessie dodges difficult situation by deactivating her senses, linking her nullifying impulse to the grave robber where she becomes corpse-like. Joubert targets Jessie because she exists in a near-death condition. She's being lulled into a grave state of dormancy. Jessie's father, giving her the nickname Mouse, commands her to stay as quiet as a mouse. She's manipulated into never telling anyone about the heinous sexual abuse committed against her. Her silence figuratively chains her to her captor. The abuse keeps Jessie confined to a deep space of embarrassment where she remains in an extended state of mortification. The solar eclipse scene is an appalling picture of child sexual molestation, in which Jessie's father masturbates behind her while she sits on his lap. Jessie's back is turned to him. Her body covers the obscene act, just as the sun is covered by the moon, and she is later asked by her dad to cover up for him. Astrologically, when the moon casts its shadow on the sun, it serves as a cosmic reminder to pause, reflect, and introspect. Solar eclipses in particular have the power to reveal what we may have been avoiding, uncovering a truth that has been obstructed. Resolving buried conflicts is what propels us forward. The monstrous Moonlight Man steals precious objects from deceased people, has sex with corpses, and consumes dead flesh. This links metaphorically with the moon hurling young Jessie into a sunless world, forcibly removing her precious life force and innocence via the abuse. Her husband, later imposing his sexual will onto Jessie, repeats this pattern. The hand signifier in the film relates to the illicit masturbation, as well as her father and Gerald working hand in glove by keeping her locked in emotional chains. Jessie escapes the cuff by cutting her own hand. Blood lubricates the extraction of the hand. The skin of the hand slips off the muscle tissue in the process. What is covered stays in the realm of darkness, whereas duly processed material peels off deceit and reintroduces light. As gory as it is, the exposed hand denotes action and liberation. The gloves are off. Something is finally done by Jessie in an uncompromising and ruthless way. By reconnecting with the divested part of herself, Jessie understands that her father's shackles were silence and Gerald's chains were comfort. The people who were supposed to protect her from the monsters turned out to be the monsters themselves. This realization compels Jessie to come out from the shadows of an inner eclipse. It is a stunning burst of personal growth that shrinks down the nefarious influence of her perpetrators. They are so much smaller than she remembers. Until next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on cinema and other topics, you can sign up to her Patreon, patreon.com/Mary Wilde. Okay, Anna, we are going to wrap up shortly, but I want to finish by just going back to the idea of these two Mike Flanagan home invasion films, kind of almost work as two sides of the same coin, right? Both kind of experiments in his craft, both kind of evolving what he would come to do. How do you find both these films on rewatch? Because in some ways they both work on a kind of almost gimmicks, right? In that you've got one that is like no dialogue, the other one that is just like one woman on a bed and only dialogue. How did you find them, the experience of rewatching both these films?
Well, it was really, like I said, really good pairing, really interesting to see them back to back, especially for me, considering everything that Flanagan has done since then.
Yeah.
I think they hold up really well because I think the high concept, kind of low budget stuff just works well all the time. You know, like the expectation is sort of so low for them, and the parameters are so strict with both these stories that if you're in, you're just in. They're a good ride. I think both of them are flawed, but both of them have like really strong performances and really strong ideas about actually, let me rephrase that. They have very strong ideas about kind of the relationship between their characters with their spaces, with their home, and the way that the film deploys that. Cinematically, I mean, like visually and narratively, how those constraints are used both to drive the characters, to let us know the characters a bit deeper because we need to spend so much time with them, and also to create horror out of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think they're both great. And like you say, they're both, neither of them are flawless, but they're both really interesting, captivating little like exercises in tension and suspense and horror, right? And this is kind of the last time we see him do this, because from this point onwards, he goes into Doctor Sleep and then all of his TV shows that are much bigger scale.
It's ensembles.
Yeah, much, much bigger. So this was the kind of, in some ways, this is kind of the end point to that era of Flanagan, isn't it, as well? And they're so good.
And I would say that these are two extremely good entry points for anyone who has not ventured into the Flanagan kind of big TV series.
Yeah.
You can get a lot of his approach to filmmaking, his approach to horror through these two films.
Love that. Anna, final two quick fire questions for you. First of all, what is your favourite Flanagan?
Oh, fuck you. How dare you, sir?
I know.
Okay. I'm going to say it's partly recency bias because I've just rewatched it, but Hill House is just top-notch, 5 stars, no notes, magnificent.
Agreed.
And I have to say Midnight Mass, holy shit, it's just so my vibe. Like existential vampires, like lapsed faith, lapsed Catholics, the whole accoutrement, Hamish Linklater, just Rahul Kohli, everything. Just monologue me to death. That's what I want. So those two would be my top Flanigans.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, not to be basic, but I think exactly the same as you. Like those two shows, The Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass, I think are about as perfect in terms of like horror television as you can get, really, you know?
Yes.
Samantha Sloyan in Midnight Mass as Bev Keane is one of the all-time great characters in television, I think, right? Just
absolutely
phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal.
Yes.
And final question for you, Anna. What is your favourite home invasion movie?
Oh, gosh. Oh, my God. The first ones that come to mind are Funny Games, the German version.
Yes.
Because I find the German actor who plays kind of the sneering guy really scary. And I remember watching that when I was in uni and being really quite affected by it. Like that was really terrifying to me. This sneering at people suffering.
Yeah.
And also the strangers, because what you put very well earlier, the fact that it's just random. We don't know who they are or why they're doing it, and it doesn't really matter. Like you don't matter. The home invasion doesn't matter. It's just a thing they do.
Yeah, exactly that. Well, there you go. Well, Anna, thank you so much. It's been, as always, such an absolute pleasure. And you've got so many amazing things going on at the moment, but tell people where they can find you, where they can find more of your work out there in the world.
It's been such a joy. It's been a while. I've missed this. This has been so great.
So yes.
So plug-wise, you can follow me on all the social medias at Anna Be Demented, although, frankly, I've been in a writing hole for the last few months. So it's mostly been pictures of books I've been reading and also my holidays. You can listen to my horror film history podcast, The Final Girls, which is just back from a long hiatus with a new season on hags and hagsploitation films from the 60s onwards. You can also buy my book, Unlikable Female Characters, wherever you get your books. And I've got a new book coming out next year that's just been announced that's all about horror called Feeding the Monster. So follow me for more details on that. And you can also listen to my horror fiction anthology podcast, which is, if I dare say so myself, creepy as fuck.
Yes.
And you can find that wherever you get your podcast. It's called Eerie, and every single episode is a different, especially commissioned original horror story by some incredible writers, filmmakers, playwrights. It's incredible. And Mike, you edited it, so we know it's going to be good. You can also listen to Mike and mine's other podcasts wherever you get your shows. We've got the Successionistas, which is all about Succession, season 4. And before that, you've got Dead by Dawn, which is all about Evil Dead films. And obviously Hello Sydney with our mutual friend Louise Blaine, which is all about the Scream films, and we cover both the old ones and the new films that have come out over the last couple of years. And I believe that is it. If I'm forgetting something, you can find it on Twitter or Instagram.
Incredible. Anna, thank you so much for joining me.
Been a pleasure. The
Successionistas!
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Anna Bogutskaya. What a treat to have her on the podcast again. So let me know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these two films, Gerald's Game and Hush. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And don't forget, if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you use, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So on to next week then. We've got another pair of creepy modern home invasion movies from the last few years. Next week I'm going to be joined by film critic and my lovely wife Rhianna Dillon, and we are going to be discussing The Gift from 2015 and Mother from 2017. Holy shit. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.